So, hi everyone, and welcome to tonight's conversation on comfort. It's the final lecture in the New Standard series this autumn. And I guess for those of you who are new to the series, its aim has been to identify and confront some of the barriers to architecture, its education and practice, and consider how these can be overcome to embrace wider forms of creativity. Each event in the series addresses the idea of comfort and challenges the idea of standards as a bare minimum or one-size-fits-all approach. So tonight is very fitting for us to finally reflect on everything we've learned and spoken about over the past few weeks, to together question how we might better provide comfort in all its nuanced forms, which is slightly ironic given how cold it is today, but hopefully everyone has their coats with them and can bundle up a bit warmer. In the interest of safety, we're trying to ventilate the room a bit better, but it is quite cold. So we normally give a special mention to Jordan Whitewood-Neal for all the conversations, collaboration, and guidance that he's given to help shape this series and at the AA as a whole. But we are really, really happy that he's here tonight with us to actually conclude the series and to talk about these bigger discussions. So we're happy to welcome him in person as a speaker. And the series also evolved out of a workshop that AA organized with the Bartlett quite a few years ago now to question space standards, which are largely based on American male militarized bodies. And this was part of Jos Boys' Disordinary project. So it's also fitting that Jos joins Jordan and Marsha Ramroop around the table tonight to discuss what we mean by comfort when designing more inclusive spaces. One of the main drivers behind this series is to examine how we can move beyond words and turn the many urgent conversations that we host within the public program into action. The series will act as a testbed for future AA events to hopefully make all events and other aspects of AA life more accessible going forward as we adjust what is considered to be the norm. The series will continue next term with a charrette or workshop in February that invites teams made up of participants of students, staff, and experts who've joined us around the table at all the sessions this series to design and build interventions in the AA, as well as suggest new policies to make it a more comfortable place for all of us to exist within. The charrette will be documented and put forward to the school as suggestions that could catalyze long-term and meaningful changes to make the school more inclusive in different ways. So while this feels sad as the last session in the series, it's really just the beginning. So I'm Manisha Verghese, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm wearing a black puffy jacket.
Hi, everyone. Shall I use this one? Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Harriet. My pronouns are she, her. I have dark brown hair, and I'm wearing also a puffer jacket, and it's sort of red and black. And I work with Manager here on the public programme at the AA. And yeah, we're so happy to have you all here tonight for the final event in this series. It's so nice to see some familiar faces who I feel like we've got to know fairly well throughout this course of events, and also lots of new faces, which is also lovely. So thanks for joining us. If this is the first time you've been to one of these talks, all the past events, you can watch them online on YouTube, so I would encourage you to do that. So yes, as Manager has already mentioned, we're so happy to have Jordan, Jos and Marsha here with us tonight. So I'm going to quickly introduce them. So Jordan is an architectural researcher, designer and artist whose work addresses disability, domesticity, pedagogy and cultural infrastructure. He is currently co-leading a design think tank at the London School of Architecture on retrofitting as a process of civic reparation. Jordan is also an Architecture Foundation Young Trustee and co-founder of disability-centered research collective DIS. Dr. Jos Boys is co-founder and co-director with Zoe Partington of the Disordinary Architecture Project, which brings disabled artists into built environment education and practice to critically and creatively rethink access and inclusion. And Marsha Ramroop is a global award-winning equity, diversion and inclusion, EDI, strategist and founder-director of Unheard Voice Consultancy. She has formulated a culture change methodology, which has been recognized as successful with an international prize. And Marsha is also vice chair of the Institute of Equality and Diversity Professionals. So after their presentations. We'll open up the conversation to take place around this table, so feel free to come and join us sitting around if you feel comfortable doing so. We'll also pass the mics around if you have any questions, and we'd love for you to all get involved. We've also got food and drink, as you can see, so don't be shy, and please come up and get some throughout the talk. Also, just to make you all aware that this event has British Sign Language interpretation. So a massive thanks to Michelle and Joanna for joining us tonight, and they're sitting opposite me here. If you need a clear line of vision to them at any point, please come and sit around the table. They're also projected up on the screen to my right. We have accessible toilets through the door at the far end of the room. If you walk through the corridor until you hit the final staircase, you'll see the bookshop door is closed, turn left, they're just down there. If you need any help finding them, just let me know and I'll help you. And yes, like Manager mentioned, we've opened the windows for ventilation, so I hope you're all cozy and warm. And we also have a quiet room over there, so feel free to go in there at any point, close the doors, and be comfortable. So I think that is everything, and I'm now very happy to hand over to Jordan. Thank you.
Yeah, so I just want to start by saying how happy I am to be here, finally. I've been researching the AA for about 2 years now. It's the first time I've actually been here, so it's nice to meet all the brilliant people I've had the pleasure of knowing virtually for the last 2 years as well. So I've titled this presentation Discomfort, Reimagining Access and Agency at the Architectural Association. Here is an image from the AA archives of an arched doorway with the stairs leading up. So there's 2 questions I wanted to sort of pivot this presentation around. Whether I'm going to answer them or not, I don't know. But they are, who is space comfortable for? And what does it mean to embrace discomfort as a form of presence and critique? So I want to begin by admittedly giving an inadequately short overview of my research into the history of disability at the AA. Thanks to Ed Bottoms, 2 years ago I was introduced to AA tutor Andrew Walker. Andrew is pictured here. He was a technical tutor at the Architectural Association, sitting in the AA's communication studio, accessed at the time via Morwell Street, which is at the opposite side of the AA's well-known 36 Bedford Square, as we all know here today. Now, I never knew Andrew Walker, but I have spoken to many who did, tutors that worked alongside him, and students who borrowed his wheelchairs to rattle down the very AA steps that are outside now. He was, by every word, a great teacher and an essential member of the school. Following an accident that resulted in a spinal injury in the 1980s, Andrew returned to his teaching position at the AA in 1982. Alvin Boyarsky, the then chair of the school, ensured there would be no issue with access in the building, but there was no lift, only a host of narrow, multi-leveled corridors, and a stepped entrance. Andrew consequently was moved to one of the few accessible rooms in the building. Now, Walker's time at the AA, like many throughout its institution's history, was partly defined by who was steering the proverbial ship. In 1991, the tenure of the AA director, Alan Balfour, began. Alvin Boyarsky had recently passed, and his directorship had had a monumental and lasting impact on the school. With Alan Balfour taking over, he brought with him a new mandate, mission, and experience and knowledge of the Americans with Disability Act. So part of Andrew's legacy at the AA, and the main focus of my research, was the environmental access course, which he proposed to Balfour and began teaching in 1992. Designed primarily as a day-release diploma for assisting practitioners in a variety of related and tangential fields. And the significance of the course was that it was a course not just of, but for disabled people. And it basically allowed many people to come into the school, both disabled and non-disabled, and engage with Andrew in a series of different pedagogical explorations about access and disability in the built environment and buildings themselves. So in her essay, What's the Use of a Building I Can't Use?, Evelyn Grace, who was a former student and the archivist for this course, describes the course as being concerned with the ways in which buildings, public spaces, and transport systems welcome, support, and inform their users, or fail to do so, or actually impedes us in going about our everyday lives. The course, in my opinion, was a profound act of care and repair by Andrew, aimed at giving disabled and non-disabled practitioners a space to communicate, debate, explore, analyse, write and design, visiting cinemas, graveyards and stately homes. He worked in pursuit of a tender pedagogy that tackled the often neglected spatial needs of those forgotten or reliably and persistently and systemically excluded from architectural education and pedagogy. His efforts were especially meaningful as it was happening inside a school whose physical, historical, and social structure had typically excluded disabled people from easy access, from canon, and from its politics. Andrew's course, however, was short-lived, coming to an end around 1999 due to a dwindling student numbers and arguably a lack of integration into the wider AA curriculum. Andrew spent just under a decade spent trying not only to construct something new in the school, but to transform something existing. The issue, however, with transformation is that it still begins from something, adopting it in some way to inform and materialize change. Within an institution, the process and lasting impact of this transformation can be challenging. In support of my research into Andrew and the course, I partly focus on the politics of affordances of spatial artefacts at the AA, such as the front and back door, the lift, and the ramp, and how before, during, and after Andrew's presence at the school, they embodied tensions, limitations, and concept of physical and social breakdown. In the letter to then director of the AA, Mohsen Mostafavi, in 1997, Andrew argued against the safety measures put in place on the Morwell Street door, his primary entrance. He protested the locks that prevent spontaneous access and the lack of identification and welcome. So this is from the AA archives, which is a letter to Mohsen, and it reads, "When I get into the building, the doors are again bolted and I am locked in. To leave the building, I either have to break the bolt or ask permission to leave and wait for assistance. I would not object if this was the case for all members of staff, but to treat me and other disabled people in this way is totally degrading to all parties and quite intolerable. It is the worst sort of ethically impoverished management practice. I am sorry if objects are being stolen from the school, but I am a human being, not an object, and take precedence." Now, it was this segment that drew my attention. I'm a human being, not an object. Discussions around access can sometimes reduce this ability to an objective idea requiring standardised and inflexible responses, and it rarely appreciates disabled people as varied, vivid, and very much alive. So we as disabled people are not only those victimised by space, its design, and its preservation, but I believe we are also sources of new forms of critique. Now I'm going to bore you with some theory. So as a quick journey through the theoretical links that informed my thesis and my research to help us better understand the significance of artefacts and their roles in space, and also the value of disability critique, we can turn to several figures. So Charles Jenks used architecture as the medium of theoretical testing. Disabled people used the body as a litmus test for built space. Certain artefacts of built space have what psychologist James Gibson coined affordances, the possibility of action a particular object embodies, like a door handle's affordance co-evolved between the door and the hand. Madeleine Ackrick and Bruno Latour adopted the idea of affordance into actor network theory, defining it as what a device allows or forbids from the actors, humans and non-human, that it anticipates. It is the morality of a setting both negative, what it prescribes, and positive, what it permits. A framing which I believe connects to critiques of access, argued by Jos, as a process which places control into the hands of one over another. Now, the idea of permitting and prescribing artifacts is also akin to Michel Foucault's idea of micro-technologies of power, which, as Helena Webster argues, is exercised power to affect the transformation of individuals into alignment with specific disciplinary norms and values. But it is how these technologies or artifacts are preserved that can determine their role in space. In the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, Walter Benjamin argues that the mechanical production of objects affects their uniqueness, or what he terms aura, which refers to the excess of meaning that attaches to any symbolic entity. From this, I read that the perpetuation of fixed objects with replicated meanings negates the possibility for adaptation or progress. This idea of mechanical reproduction can be analogous with Heinz von Wurst's idea of triviality in education, the idea that education is in many ways designed to create reliable, trivial, replicated outputs of knowledge. In contrast, however, Walter Benjamin's idea of mimesis, which seems to argue for a process of production that does not exactly replicate but slowly translates and develops, reflects in some way von Wurst's counter-idea of non-triviality, asking how education can produce what I like to call unreliable knowledge. Nick Pine writes about Benjamin's seminal text of production in relationship to education and knowledge, concluding that, and quote, "The case of Walter Benjamin can serve, perhaps, as a reminder that the objects of knowledge are not self-announcing entities, that curricula are always works of production and reproduction, and that our sense of what are significant objects of discourse will itself shift through changes in technologies and changing frameworks of sense-making." But what is the purpose of this string of theories? Fundamentally, they set out a series of ways to understand how an artifact, such as a door, can be understood not merely as an entrance into a school, but something which embodies bias, meaning, politics, and exclusion. But what these ideas also lack in highlighting is how space can embody control or questionable moralities, and how spaces and artifacts can be, for some, such as disabled people, unreliable, with the consequence that unreliable space equals reliable people. What disability brings to this discussion is that we can highlight the affordance of an object, we counter the imposed alignment of microtechnologies of power, we negate reproduction and question meaning, and we embrace non-trivial forms of knowledge. So the image on the screen now is a section of the AA taken from, I believe it was early 1900s, which sort of says a cross-section from sort of Bedford Square to Marlborough Street. So if we return to the AA, this theoretical understanding of artifacts and disabled critique of them raises questions about the role institutions play in the social reproduction of static artifacts. The Bedford Square door and the Marlborough Street door each have an aura, but their excessive meaning derives from widely different sources. This aura can also be read as a rhetoric, the communication of meaning that persuades one of a certain idea or an ideal. Now, spatial rhetoric, I believe, is important to understanding inequities and restrictions in the spaces we inhabit. This essentially suggests that artifacts like lifts, doors, and ramps are political in the sense they do not only embody questions of access directly, but that their relationships as a mediator between institutions and people signify wider social issues and tensions. Now, the Morwell Street entrance is a significant artifact, not only due to the issues Andrew highlights in his letter to Mostafavi, but also when it is understood as a back door, a door in opposition to the main entrance to the AA, accessed via Bedford Square. So this diagram illustrates, at a very basic level, the AA in two ways. The orange, if you can see it on the screen, is part of the ground floor, freely accessible with a ramp located in Bedford Square. Without it, requiring the use of the Marlborough Street entrance, the freely accessible part of the AA is reduced to a handful of rooms cut off physically from the rest of the school, which is highlighted in blue. This was in many ways Andrew's AA. Now, this may relate directly to physical disability, but it also speaks more generally to how disability is respected by space and how our spontaneity can be devalued. Now, this is even more poignant when we consider the letter from the AA archive, which I found quite early in the research, which shows the Bloomsbury Conservation Area Advisory Committee, a very catchy name, in 1993, writing to Bedford Estates, saying that the access ramp into the AA is not accessible. Shortly after this communication, the AA actually had to take the ramp down and sort of, in some ways, eliminated spontaneous access to the school, which is, unfortunately, a situation that goes on to this day. So therefore, ramps and doors can no longer be seen as passive and inconsequential, but directly related to disability and its value in space. So on the screen now we have two images. On the left is the Marlborough Street entrance, and on the right is Bedford Square. This photo is actually taken with the existing ramp that was there in the sort of 1990s, which Andrew used to use and various others into the school, and that's the one that was taken down. So an entire chapter of Sarah Ahmed's book, Complaint, titled If These Doors Could Talk, is dedicated to both the physical and analogous use of the door as representative of the barriers in education, but also of symbols of control and power. In the dressing notes who open the door, she says, I then turn to the question of who holds the door, as a way of asking who can progress within the system and who cannot. Doors, in other words, teach us about how power can become concentrated or handy, power as that which can be held over others. So the door for Ahmed, are predominantly analogies, but at the AA they're physical and they're distance. Am I right for time? Yeah. So Francesco Milizia said that doors must be convenient to the body of man. But what this normative perspective ignores is that disabled people rarely have the luxury of convenience, let alone comfort. But maybe this is not comfort in architecture education that we need to seek first. Maybe it's discomfort. Andrew Walker, his course, and its pedagogy represents, let me make sure I'm on the right slide, yes, represent a critique of architecture education which possibly unintentionally grapple with discomfort as a form of presence. So what is not being argued against here is that the architectural education is in a constant state of change, producing and reproducing knowledge in students. But what is at question is the methodologies and social political processes by which this change happens. The fundamental absence of disabled people from education, and specifically architectural education, highlights a severe and what should be troubling absence in the system of knowledge making, because knowledge making in architecture results in the making of built space. In the wider context of disability and its role in the provocatively unreliable production of the built environment, we, disabled people, should be understood not as bodies dependent on the production of reliable spaces, but instead as makers of space, which questions our imposed reliability. So, in response to this idea of presence and absence, to stories hidden away and experiences almost forgotten, ideas and action are emerging. Last year, I, James Acker-Hass, who's just over there, and Anna Curzon-Price, held an event titled Invisible Tales at the London Festival of Architecture, where disabled practitioners and artists came together to share our own experiences of built space. This event led to the founding of DIS, a disability-centered research collective that responds to many of the things highlighted by our research: the isolation and atomization of disabled voices, the erasure of disabled action and progress by the forgetfulness of time and institutional priority, and the fundamental and exuberant value of disabled experience. The value, I believe, in discomfort is that it does not allow access to act as the patch by which disability is resolved. Instead, it places us front and centre, as opposition to normality and as advocates for abundance and distortion. We believe that this has the potential to follow the words of David Gisson, who argues that we must witness disability as a fundamental feature of the materials, construction, and imagery of the built environment, one that has the capacity to both to disrupt the architectural past as well as to make us rethink how to represent that past. For a renewed understanding and knowledge of disabilities placed in the past, like Andrew Walker, we can consequently reimagine our places and value in the present, and the fundamental role we can play in reconceptualizing pedagogy and space.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you. I'm Marsha Ramroop. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a brown woman with black hair. I'm wearing a black blazer, black trousers, an orange blouse, and I've got amazing orange shoes on. Come and have a feel of them later if you wish. If I sit here and I say to you, you're biased, you're sexist, you're racist, you're transphobic, you're ableist, would you argue with me? Would you shut down? Would you walk away? Would you engage? Would you discuss? Would you accept? There's a white woman I know called Robin Schlenger, and she appeared on Reba Radio last year, the radio station that I ran for Reba on inclusion in the built environment when I was the director of inclusion there. And she, along with the architect Jim Rooney and the CEO of Open City, Finn Harper, appeared on a segment talking about white shame and discomfort. And she's been doing anti-racism work for years. And she describes herself as a racist anti-racist. And I would call myself a prejudiced anti-racist. What does that mean? Both terms are an acknowledgement that we live in a racist system. And unless we are daily, constantly, consciously tackling the systems and calling out the incidents of racism and working to overturn them, we're not anti-racist. Bystanders are part of the system. To not fight it is to accept it because the system is working for you. I'm a prejudiced anti-racist because the system of racism doesn't work for me, and yet I've been ideologized, educated, socialized into this system, but I have no power in it. So the discriminatory thoughts and behaviors I may have towards racialized groups is prejudice rather than racism, because inherent in being a racist is a power position. Jane Elliott, the renowned anti-racism educator, famous for her blue eyes, brown eyes experiment in the 1960s, do look it up if you haven't heard about it, would also famously would ask a room like this one, if you're white, stand up if you choose to live your life as a black person in this country. And no one would ever stand. And if you know yourself how you would answer that question, then you know inherently that it's a problem that needs to be tackled. No one should be in fear of how they live in this country or anywhere else simply because of their identity. Invariably, such language causes discomfort, defensiveness, fear. Let's be clear. We are all human, and therefore, to be human is to be biased. That is a biological fact. Some biases are useful, some are unhelpful. It is impossible to be aware of your unconscious biases. How can you be aware of your unconscious? If the thought or behavior was unconscious, then by its very nature, you were unaware of it. Whether your biases are conscious or unconscious, the only way to mitigate them, according to masses of research, is not awareness training. Also speaking on Reba Radio, a resource that I recommend you all delve into, and for the architects amongst you, it does actually count as CPD. Dr. Pragya Agarwal, author of Sway, Unraveling Unconscious Bias, said, "We are all human and we are all biased. We need some of these templates or stereotypes or biases to process information in the real world. When we're bombarded with information, more so with social media and so on, our brains don't have the capacity to process it in a rational manner. We make quick, impulsive, hasty decisions. The thing is, these quick, hasty processes that our brain goes through, whilst biologically essential, aren't always helpful. That's why we need something else. Because we can have the best HR policies, the most amazing initiatives to uplift the underrepresented. We can even have awards for our EDI work, but it all counts for nothing if there's not the support, leadership, and behaviours to implement those policies, not just write them, to continue to support the underrepresented throughout their careers, not just at the beginning, to follow through on the promise of those awards, not just celebrate winning them. We need in the profession of architecture, in architecture education, in architecture design, and in all aspects of the sector, to develop the behaviours so we can create, implement, and enforce the procedures, practices, and policies that might mitigate the impact of unhelpful bias. How do we develop the behaviours to mitigate bias? Unhelpful bias is especially activated when we're faced with difference. That is not something that's happened overnight. It's been centuries, millennia in the making, where those that benefit from reinforcing ideas of what is different and difference keep perpetuating those myths that maintain the status quo. And so I mentioned it in relation to my own biases. We are thoroughly socialized, educated, ideologized into absorbing these unhelpful biases. We didn't stand a chance. We had no choice. Thankfully, there's a whole heap of research that's been done over the last 20 years in what we can do to combat it, to give ourselves that chance, to give ourselves that choice. The research question that's now been asked of more than 250,000 people across 170 countries is, what's the difference between those that succeed in today's multicultural, globalized world and those that fail? What's the difference between success and failure when working and relating across difference? And the answer's been coming back consistently. We need 4 combined skills and attributes. We need motivation. We've got to want to work and relate effectively with those who are different from us. We've got to feel the fear and do it anyway. We've got to lean into that discomfort that is consciously facing our biases. We've got to have the drive. We need understanding. We've got to discover what we don't know. We've got to realise what we'll never know. We've got to acknowledge that others have experiences that we will never have, but must listen to. We've got to get to grips with whatever we believe to be true. The opposite may also be true. We've got to have knowledge. We've got to think about what we're thinking about. We've got to take that knowledge and check it, check our assumptions. We've got to be hugely self-aware about our own perspectives and power. We've got to plan for the different outcomes, for example, our potential policy might give rise to. We've got to have strategy. And we need adaptable behaviours. We've got to realise everyone needs something different from us in order to be effective at working and relating with them. We need to have a repertoire of adaptability that is still authentic to us. This is about making a choice, not about covering or code switching to hide. It's about the process to bring about inclusion, not assimilation. We need to have action. These 4 attributes, drive, knowledge, strategy, and action, are the behaviours of the culturally intelligent and having the capability to work and relate effectively with those who are different from you. And they're the behaviours that the architectural profession must develop in order to be successful at the policies to support the underrepresented in the profession and to be truly inclusive of every part of it. As we face an uncertain future of climate change and increasing conflicts of all kinds, we must look on the flip side at the possibility within of people, not as problems to solve, but as a potential to unfold to our shared values, our shared planet, our shared humanity, setting new standards which are cognizant and inclusive of us all. We are human beings, not objects. We have to face our discomfort because inclusion isn't about other people and their characteristics. It's about us. and our behaviours. It's about looking in the mirror. It's the introspective piece of work. It's the most difficult, uncomfortable piece of work there is. But by far, it's the most important. And so, Amanda Gorman says, it's easy to harp, harder to hope. This truth, like the white-blown sky, can only be felt in its entirety or not at all. The glorious was not made to be piecemeal. Despite being drenched with dread, this dark girl still dreams. We smile like a sun that is never shunted. Since the world is round, there is no way to walk away from each other, for even then, we're coming back together. Some distances, if allowed to grow, are merely the greatest proximities.
Jos Boys, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm an older white woman in her 60s. I'm also wearing a puffer jacket because it's cold. And I'm here, I guess, because I'm co-founder and co-director of something called the Disordinary Architecture Project, which I developed with a disabled artist called Zoe Partington, and has been working since about 2007, 2008, with the intention of bringing disabled artists into architectural education practice as a way of co-developing alternative modes of practice. So we don't do access consultancy. We're not about how to make the built environment work better. We're actually saying that the problem is, Marsha's saying that we need to look at ourselves, but we're also saying we have to look at the nature and the structure of architectural education and architecture as a discipline. So we're saying it's architecture that has to change if we're able to think about and disability as a concept and disabled people as a constituency in a much richer and more equitable way. It's fantastic to be asked this really complex set of questions, which is a managerial set of questions about the very entangled questions about what constitutes comfort, how that relates to standards, and how that in turn relates to the actual hugely diverse neuro and biodiversity of both human and non-human life, the variety of us, and to notions of disability and how they play out. So what I wanted to do is think a little bit about what kinds of critical and creative tools are available to us to think through this and actually to act as designers, to act as activists, to engage both personally and politically. So for me, the first step in that is critiquing these terms. It's like comfort is a really complex thing to be untangled, and the first thing we need to do is explore the work that a concept like that is actually doing. What does it do within architecture? What has it done? How is it used? How does it become a kind of common sense notion, both in everyday life, but also within the nature of the discipline as it has developed? And what's it doing in terms of who it's normalising, who's getting noticed and valued, and who is being marginalised and or ignored or somehow falls down the cracks, never gets talked about at all. So to reiterate both the previous speakers, it's all about power. We have to unpick the power. We can't just say, the ideal world would be something that made us all comfortable, made us all at ease. It's not, just avoiding. It's avoiding as much as it solves. So when I was an architecture student in the 1970s, the expression was environmental comfort. That was really what everybody focused on. That's how the word comfort came into our educational experience, and I think there may still be some aspects of that are happening. And that was something which was about technical standards, it was about ergonomics, it was solution-driven, and it was offered up as a kind of objective, scientific and neutral way of understanding the world. So the image that I'm showing here, will only be showing 6 images, this image is, and most of the ones that I've taken, this is an image taken from an interior, from a huge atrium of a building in New York. And from the atrium space, you look up at, and in the image, the atrium space itself is dark, and you look up at floor-to-ceiling glazed, open glazed area, and you see beyond it, the thing I want to talk about first is the environment. You see beyond it a very typical ergonomically designed, environmental comfort designed ceiling. It's got strip lights, it's all even, and it's all quite bland and ugly. So, you know, how can we unpick that? I'm not even going to talk about the other element of this slide. I'll begin to talk about it in a minute. But if we're just looking at that environment, this weird space that we look up at with this kind of yellow light and this gridded ceiling panels, what are the kind of different ways we can unpick that in terms of notions of comfort? And I want to talk first of all about standards, because just as I'm saying we should unpick what the word comfort or the concept of comfort, how it comes to do different things in different situations, what it comes to be used for, we can do the same about standards. How are standards constructed, promoted, and stabilised? What is the process by which we come to have certain kinds of standards? The second thing we need to unpick is what kinds of normal are being reproduced when buildings are designed like that. But then we also need to realise that simultaneously and crucially, how incomplete and inadequate standards inherently are. Like it's an impossible trick, this idea that if you somehow just organise the data and analyse the data, that you can come to a true universal solution for everybody. So all of that is going on in the image, and I wanted to, it's quite an uneven book, but Martha Lampland and Susan Lee Starr have written a book called Standards and Their Stories, and I just wanted to quote from that because I think it overlaps a lot with what Jordan has said and Marsha. The push to standardise presumes the ability to constrain a phenomenon within a particular set of dimensions, as well as the ability to dictate behaviour to achieve the narrowly defined dimensions that stipulate its outcome. A great deal of work is conducted to make the standard possible, and then this must be followed up by agents committed to implementation and oversight. Standardisation is a recursive practice, necessarily historical, and embedded in a series of complex events and social structures. So just unpicking how standards come to be is also itself a really important sociological, political and historical intervention. And we do already have various bits of research that work in this area. Caroline Criado-Perez, his book on invisible women, again, that's become quite popular. It's showing very clearly how the particular way in which standards are developed and normalised often are based on men and not on, and that they have very different effects for women. Amy Hamray, who some of you may have read, is a really interesting disability study scholar from the States, and they've written a fantastic book called Building Access, which explores all these things. It explores how access comes to be translated from out of disability activism into a particular set of standards which are understood as if they're technical and neutral, and which by the time you come to study architecture, you get in a guide, you get as design guidance, and you just use it as if it's true, and not as if it has this huge, complex, knotty history. There is nothing written yet about, well, hardly anything. There's a little bit about Selwyn Goldsmith, but in terms of the UK, that history has not yet been written. It still doesn't exist, and it's really vital. And Amy's book is a really good start. And then there are people like David Gisson, who Jordan has already mentioned, and whose new book on architecture and disability will be out in the new year. And he's done some really interesting work around architectural theory and around how you can actually look at buildings and the kind of assumptions they make about what kinds of bodies are to be to use them. And one of his early pieces looked at the Acropolis and basically showed that when it was originally in the ancient world, it had this huge fucking ramp going up to the front of it because, of course, it was a big ceremonial entry. So actually what everybody did in this very ceremonial way was march up in this very direct and accessible route, and that it was only a kind of romantic 19th century understanding of how you should engage with buildings, particularly old buildings, which meant that a walk was kind of designed which let you catch glimpses and go around corners, and so that your relationship to the building was very much a very different one, which he would say was very much a romantic notion. So there we have access not as a functional need, but as an interpretive tool. And Dave Gisson is really good at that, really interesting, as is Jordan. So all of these people start from the concept that comfort is not obvious or normal, or standards are not obvious or normal, but they're socially constructed, they're contested, they're nuanced, and they're uneven in their development. If we are going to focus on comfort, so I'm trying to unpick this image in different ways. I haven't talked about the key element in the image, which is a picture, which is a woman who's clearly a cleaner, and she's kneeling on the ground. She's so she's on full view. She's doing something which is part of comfort, but which is normally invisible labour. She's maintaining and cleaning the building, and she's looking back. I can't quite believe this because it looks like she's looking directly at me, but I was in a huge crowd of people. So actually what she's doing is she's looking at this crowd of people who have entered the building to go to a conference, and there she is on display doing this job which is somehow meant to be an invisible job. So the kind of role of cleaning, maintenance, care and repair is that hidden aspect of comfort, of buildings being comfortable. And then what we have is her discomfort. She's exposed, she's put in an uncomfortable position. And so all those things to me are very, they're part of how we might unpick this. And I'm good, let's see. So if that's my first point, which is the kind of tools we need, which is just really unravelling what these kinds of concepts are and not just taking them for granted. Jordan mentioned actor network theory and there's, science and technology studies, and I have been quite influenced by something called ethnomethodology, somebody called Harold Garfinkel, from the 1970s, and it's got lots of problems with it, but he's also really interested in the huge amount of everyday work that we do, and it relates very much to what we've just heard about our behaviours, to reproduce the everyday. We don't even notice that we're doing it. And it's a kind of commonplace world where people know what everyone knows and does. And I'm really interested in exploring that space of nothing much, like nothing much happens. It's just normal, it's just what is. And how that ordinariness actually has huge consequences for those who cannot be ordinary. So non-normative body minds, and in the implications that has for the everyday occupation of built space. So the second thing I wanted to talk about is breaching. You're going to have to shut me up this one. No. Just going on at great length. So I'm really interested in this notion of breaching, and breaching comes from methodology. And the idea of breaching is the way that you find out what is completely normal is you challenge it. You just don't do it. And for a lot of disabled people, that's, it's like you challenge it whether you want to or not. But it's also, in a setting like this, if it would really be comfortable to stim or to make, that you make noises, or you actually really need to lie down on the floor because your back is killing you, all of those things are going to be something which, in most environments, like in a lecture theatre, people will notice. And they will kind of police. They're like, why are they behaving oddly? So the whole point of breaching is to think, okay, what is it that breaches? And that's how you work out what's normal. And for me, some of you may have seen this picture before. I show it a lot because I took it at Gatwick Airport, And it's a kind of unexpected breaching, because here we have no queue for the ladies' toilet. We can see the ladies' sign, and we can see there's nobody there. And then we have a queue of 6 men we can see for the gents. So the men are having to queue up. And they don't know what to do. They have never done this. Women know this, completely and utterly. And it's kind of normal. It's kind of normal, yeah, women have to queue, oh, well, they take longer. And nothing's ever been done about it. There is no change in the standards. The standards stay the same, and it is a problem with how the standards are organised. So here, the men are like, oh, they're really shuffling. The women, as they go into the ladies, every single one of them laughed out loud. They all went, and then walked in. So there we have a really interesting form of breaching that reminds us of something that would be quite easy to change, actually, in terms of standards, but doesn't get changed because it is so normalised. It's so what happens that it happens. And that, for me, is really interesting. So that's one form of breaching. But then I think this is another photograph that I love of mine. It's of mine, because I collect photographs like this. So here we have an older woman. She's sitting she's got heavy bags, and she's sitting on what is clearly a bicycle rack. So she's found a place to sit down and rest, which she clearly needs to do. And she's hacked something that already exists to make that possible. Rather wonderfully, the advertising sign behind says headache, which I've always really loved, by her head. And so for me, here we have somebody who's actually acting very creatively and adapting what exists. But we also have something about who is comfortable, who isn't. Is that comfortable to sit like that? Well, not really. But she's making the best of what she can find. The comfort is aimed at, in terms of the investment, is aimed at people who bicycle. And we live in cities at the moment, certainly in Europe, where the bicycle is everything. And I will come back to this about why that's also about a particular sort of valuing of particular bodies over others. I'm not against it. I like cycling, but I'm just saying we have to unpick that. And then my third example, which some of you may know, is from a fantastic video made by Astra Taylor of the feminist philosopher Judith Butler, talking to a disabled activist and writer called Sonara Taylor. It's part of a series called Examined Life, which has different philosophers in it. And although in the image that we see, the screenshot that we see, they're actually in a second-hand, in a vintage shop, choosing clothes, because Sonara got very cold and they went to look for a jumper for her. But they're talking about an experience that Sonara talks about, which relates entirely to this notion of how comfort is not anything. It's not just a functional ergonomic thing. In fact, it's hardly that. It's about social comfort, social discomfort, social ease and unease. And so she's talking about how when she's in a coffee shop, the most easy thing for her to do is to pick up a cup in her mouth and take it to the table that way. And how that's comfort and ease for her. But it's so uncomfortable for other customers in the coffee shop that she hardly ever does it. So she is policed by that kind of normalising standards of movement and what is and isn't possible in different situations. And again, for me, that thing about everyday practices and how they work and how policing works, I always talk about toilets a lot. The amount of policing that non-disabled people do of disabled toilets is extraordinary. They police people going to them if they don't think they're disabled enough, or if they think they're too disabled, or the business, it's like you can't just leave people alone, disabled people alone. It's extraordinary. So for me, there are also really great conceptual frameworks for thinking about this. And again, we don't tend to get introduced to them within architecture and built environment education and practice. There's Rosemary Garland-Thompson, who talks about fitting and misfitting. All of these are relational. They're always saying it depends on the situation and the space. There's Sarah Ahmed in queer phenomenology, who talks about spaces being oriented towards certain people or oriented away from them. So she doesn't see it in a deterministic way. She sees it as something that depends. And then I remember Aaron Williamson, in your very first talk, he talks about he's one of the disabled artists that works with Disordinary sometimes, and he talked about, he specialises in these kinds of creative breaching. He talks about provocations as a kind of creative and political act, and about playing around with comfort and discomfort and social obedience and disobedience. I keep reaching for the computer since it's there. So I said I'd just go back to the thing about cycling, and I seem to be going back to seating too, and seating on bike racks. This is a Disordinary architecture project we did this summer for a group called Theatre Foreman, and which was led by disabled artists and architects, led particularly by deaf architects, and playing around with ideas of deaf gain and deaf space, which I can talk a bit more about. But one of the little side effects that we did, I mean, it's in a way, it's like something that might be done anyway, you know, like you can convert these cycle racks into seats, but it was actually a kind of political act, because for the blind and the deaf people involved, this space, which was a public space, a pedestrian space, but where a lot of cyclists came through all the time, was actually really dangerous. So for the festival, we were deliberately trying to stop people cycling through, because if you're blind, you can't see them as they creep up on you, and if you're deaf, you can't hear them. And so it was a kind of deliberate insistence on shifting that balance. I wanted to end really around where I think these things can change, and that they are already changing. And some of that is just, I think, displacing the notion of comfort. Maybe there are other terms we can use, like human flourishing, interdependence, collective care. And I want to talk about something called access intimacy, which comes from Maya Mingus, who works with is one of the 3 founders of the Disability Visibility Project. And then I think there's also the issue about standards and how we have new ways of working through those and having an alternative version. And I think the kind of work that's coming out of disability activism, creativity at the moment, is actually really engaging with those issues. It's just that it's not penetrating, again, our world. So I'm going to read her 2017 description about access intimacy, which is particularly aimed at able-bodied people. I understand access intimacy as something that can transform ordinary access into a tool for liberation, instead of merely reinforcing inclusion and equality. I am done with disability simply being included in able-bodied agendas and lives only when it is convenient. I want us to tap into the transformative powers of disability instead of only gaining access to the current system and doing nothing to change that system. We don't simply want to join the ranks of the privileged. We want to challenge and dismantle those ranks and question why some people are consistently at the bottom. Cultivating access intimacy is a way to directly challenge ableism and the relentless isolation that disabled people endure, especially disabled folks who are part of other oppressed communities. Access intimacy at once recognises and understands the relational and human quality of access, while it simultaneously deepens the relationships involved. It moves the world of access out of the realm of only logistics and into the realm of relationships and understanding disabled people as humans, not burdens. Disabled people's liberation cannot be boiled down to logistics. Access intimacy is interdependence in action. It is an acknowledgement that what is most important is not whether or not things are perfectly accessible or whether or not there is ableism, but rather what the impact of inaccessibility and ableism is on disabled people and our lives. In my experience, when access intimacy is present, the most powerful part is having someone to navigate access and ableism with. So for me, that really relates to what you were saying. That's part of, and I feel like my role, I come to this as the only non-disabled person in Disordinary and as the only architect, although as I get older, there's a lot of blurring as to whether I'm disabled or not. But, and we have lots of discussions about that.
Acquired disability.
Exactly, how, anyway, we can talk about that later. But I think thinking about what it is to have solidarity, to be an ally, and not to get kind of caught up in your own awkwardness or embarrassment as a non-disabled person, for me, that's vital. And I think it absolutely links to what both the previous speakers said. It's about finding ways of just relaxing into and having pleasure with and recognising the enormous value of all of us. Thank you.
I guess, first of all, thank you so much to the three of you for three really powerful and, yeah, I think uncomfortable presentations, which is really important. I think before the talk started, Marsha, you said, I was surprised you called this comfort and not discomfort. And I don't actually remember when we were discussing the title, like how we landed on comfort, but I think something that really linked all your talks together, but also where you kind of finished, Jos, was I think thinking of new ways or different things to put value on rather than comfort. And I remember a friend of mine and I talking about the value of sitting with discomfort, that so many of us are trying to smooth out social tensions about, either having to make it more comfortable for other people who can't pronounce your name, or are trying to find the right thing to say to address a disability. I know that I've also done that in the past, especially going to the workshops you organized, and then being educated about what maybe was the right terminology to say. So I think there is a value to discomfort and sometimes saying the wrong thing in order to figure out or to listen and learn. And I think, Marsha, you talked about that we're all human, and actually the most important thing is to have these conversations. I think, Jordan, the material you showed, especially that letter by Andrew Walker to write that to Moisen and to have to advocate that his life was more important than objects. It just felt so painful and powerful that there was a need to do that. But I guess I just wanted to open up the conversation by maybe talking about how to place more value on discomfort. And I guess a lot of the conversations we've had over the last several weeks have been uncomfortable, but really interesting as a result of that. And it's allowed us to kind of explore things that maybe we haven't been able to explore in the past, and hopefully it's the beginning of bigger conversations. So I don't know if you each want to start by responding to that.
Yeah, may I take that one? It's a bit trite, and I actually don't really believe it. There's a phrase that goes around, you need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I suppose it's just the semantics of the way we use language, that somehow discomfort is something negative. And I never say you need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. What I say is we need to lean into our discomfort. And when we lean into our discomfort, that's where we know we will learn and grow. And that's what I encourage people to do, knowing especially if we're talking about issues of inclusion, that is what is required in order to be able to be better humans to each other. And in addition to this, a part of that is recognising to be human and to be biased means we make mistakes. To be human is to make mistakes. And recognising how we manage those mistakes is how we are going to be effective humans to each other. And again, this is about the sense that there is so much fear and negativity around mistake making, that we're not very good at understanding how we should deal with the feedback that we get, that we need to consider that it doesn't really matter what the tone of that feedback is sometimes. That's the introspective piece of work. What have I done wrong here? What do I need to acknowledge, listen to, learn from, reflect on, so I can move forward differently? All of these things are useful for us as humans, because then we can we're more able to lean into that discomfort as a growing, potentially, liberating experience.
I think I missed some of that, as you can tell, because I had to leave the room. But the only thing what's interesting for me about, I think what you said, Anna-Jay, is really important, but I also think that it's very, it can be very easy for it to become about non-disabled people. It's like it's about us. Oh, we'll manage our own discomfort. And I do think that's really important, but I also think it's like somehow, non-normative body, mind, disabled people can get lost in that, because it becomes, it somehow moves the centre of attention back. And when you're talking about, just the huge ways in which we're all different, I think that's really important. But in terms of the very real, because I decided for various reasons to really concentrate around the complexity of disability and disabled people, and the lives of disabled people and their knowledge and experience, and it's really, that's real discrimination that we're somehow still pushing that aside. And I think, so for me, the issue is actually about that we should get much angrier about stuff. So maybe I want to replace comfort and discomfort with anger. That the kind of just getting into this building. Jordan, get in this building. How complex that is. That should not be. That's outrageous. We should all be outraged that this building goes on making it a complete nightmare, and has done, for Andrew Walker, but still does. How many years later is that?
Only 25.
Only 25, yes.
Yeah, no. Can we talk about anger?
Jordan, do you want to say something?
Only thing I was going to add to that was, I think it'd be nice to talk about comfort and discomfort in relationship to architectural education, because I would argue that education and pedagogy at the moment has got comfortable in that what we learn, how we do it, the way we teach, is all sort of following similar patterns that that's people been doing for ages. And that's what I found so inspiring about Andrew's pedagogy, was that in a way disrupted that. It not only made the school uncomfortable, but it embraced discomfort as a way of learning new things. I think as soon as you become comfortable, you stop learning new things and you start propagating and doing the same thing over and over again. So, as a approach to pedagogy, I think discomfort is really important.
There are a couple of things that I want to say about it's really interesting how you frame it in the architectural education space, because certainly I think through what I think is creative conflict, that input of very different ideas and perspectives, that you get real innovation, proper, movement forward in the way that we need to create our spaces. But I just wanted to pick up on the anger idea, because I do recommend, I'm not on her payroll, but Pragya Agarwal has another book called Hysterical, The Myth of Gendered Emotions. I highly recommend it, because it really talks about what it means to express our emotions and the way that they've been, defined in certain ways. But anger, I always say that we need to get angry, because how else do we know that there's an injustice to fight? We must get angry. anger is a very useful emotion to help us identify that something needs to be different here, actually. And the fact that, you know, the stiff upper lip is a cultural thing, that we somehow park that in a way that isn't useful. But to be angry doesn't mean necessarily that you have to express yourself in any one particular way, but capture your anger always and look to act on it in a way that is constructive, because there's clearly something that needs to be done here. And this is where I'm talking about holding up that mirror, because the agency for change is very much within our own hands. Let's see what we can do to make the change we want to see.
It's more of a comment, really, on leaning into discomfort. I think one of the most amazing things about disability today is the sharing of experiences, which is what Jordan and I try to do in our collective. And I remember years ago, whenever you trip over on the street because of bad access, the blame would be on you for sort of not being able to navigate it correctly. Whereas these days, I feel like there's more collective response to that problem. So I think for me, leaning into discomfort shouldn't always be placed on the individual, but it should allow us to comment on structures which make that problem.
Hi, I've got so many things. This is a really good talk, honestly. Like, super amazing. I've got so many things, but I guess I'll just chat with you afterwards. But I really liked Jos when you mentioned Mia Mingus, because I really love their work. And like, the way I got into Mia Mingus was through the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective. And I think they're in, like, with the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, there's like a methodology that I think kind of helps with this idea of like discomfort and like community accountability. Like, and I think accountability is like the most important kind of concept we can take from this in terms of like anti-racism work, anti-ableist work. You know, the idea that someone is able to critique this building and this institution is a form of accountability. The problem is it's not enough just to express the problem. There just needs to, the person that has done the harm needs to be held accountable for it. And one thing I really liked about the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective is they have this project called Pods. Have you heard of the Pods project, right? So it's a project where they were trying to find a way for like young children to hold like basically abusers accountable. And they created a system where each person within a pod has like one or two people that will be basically a confidant or like a person that will hold them accountable. So a child says like, you know, if a child is like experiencing something, they will tell their person that's in their pod, and then someone, if there's another person in that pod, then will hold, every person in that pod also has to have a person also that holds them accountable for harm that they've caused, and then that person will have the duty to like tell that person that they've fucked up or done something horrible and hold them accountable. But this only works if someone is open to being held accountable. We've all been in that situations where we're like witness someone doing something fucked up, but we don't know whether it's polite to go and like talk to them about them, or we don't want to bear the emotional weight. But when we make it our duty, not only to hold them accountable, but there's no point in holding someone accountable if they don't want to be held accountable. They'll just be resistant. That's the biggest problem in this whole thing, right? So a huge shame, though, is that we have all this critique, and the problem is everyone that's in this room listening to stuff is open to this, but the problem is about people that really couldn't give a shit about this. You know? So I think there needs to be kind of this culture of accountability and like community care, and that is, I guess, like how I do work with like Killing Justice London, and like I don't know where Farzana, I don't know if you've heard of her, gets this quote, but she talks about capitalism as an act of breaking relationships, and like that's kind of the problem, though, is that if we have this problem of like what would normally be resolved through community accountability then becomes a solution that you market as like as a product for someone to fix a problem that really shouldn't be fixed with a product, you know? It becomes this whole marketized system. Anyway, I'm rambling on, but yeah, I just wanted you guys to respond on the provocation of accountability, I guess, in this framework.
I've always got something to say. It won't surprise you that I've been asked a similar question before. How is it that in a room like this, aren't we just preaching to the converted? Everyone who's listening in, those who've dialed in, who are watching it now, they're already on this journey. We believe in, you know, holding ourselves accountable, but also being able to provoke others. And what about those who are not in the room? So I've thought about this a lot, and I have a sort of solution, I suppose. And this is where I think for our own well-being as well, I'm very keen on pushing those doors that are already ajar and working with those who are already starting to look at how to have this conversation. And within that, I think the way I summarize it is we need to seize this moment to create momentum and then maintain a movement. Because together, by organising ourselves actually to do this work well, by having some very clear strategies to be able to move it well together, contacting each other, communicating about different best practices, and being very vocal about this is the way that needs to be done, then we have that opportunity to create the moment, maintain momentum, and make that movement happen. So in the end, those who aren't in the room will have no choice but to come along with the tide. And we can do it. Say again? Yeah, and I think you're right. I think there are some key moments that are happening, but they're kind of losing their potency. So if we're looking at racism and we're looking at the devastation around George Floyd's death, 2 years down the line, you know, it's kind of fading, and that is when these things happen, it is up to us to keep strong and to maintain the work that we're trying to do, because we have to believe in it. And like I say, move forward the profession.
All right, I'll go first, Jordan. I think I do. I'm going to slightly throw something into the mix because I'm obviously the one who says let's complicate this a bit, and so I'm really interested. I think there's a whole issue around agency. And there's a kind of assumption, and you see it built into all sorts of critical theories, and you see it built into kind of politics, which is we do all have agency, and we have an equivalence of agency, and we just need to get together and make that agency work. And I think that it underestimates the different situations where you have very little agency. Some of that may be political, it may be the country you're in, some of it, and I think that for a lot of people, particularly people with visible disabilities, but also in a different way, people who have hidden disabilities, you can be as forceful and as you like with non-disabled people, but you are defined, and it happens around colour. So for people of colour, it happens around race, it happens around sexuality. I mean, it's not just disabled people, but I think so. For me, and it kind of relates to what you said, it takes a different part of it, which I really like, which is that notion of transformative disability justice. And it says, we're not all in this together, even though it's really important that, for me as a non-disabled person, I need to be really working not to be racist or sexist or all those things, and that's all I can work at it. I never get it right. But also, that actually it is this flipping over, that it's about respecting, learning from, listening to, being modest about our own, what we're doing, and recognising the huge amount of work that's going on, and I'll talk about disability entirely, with groups like that, with the Disability Visibility Project, with Access is Love, which is another project that they're doing, with all the stuff around care work. There's some really fantastic stuff coming out of disability activism at the moment, which is absolutely looking at the things that we're trying to get our heads around. And for me, I just want to pass that stuff on, and I just want to be. I feel like I want to be working with disability-led groups that are, and I'm focusing particularly on disability, but that are, and a lot of those. The stuff from the States is very intersectional anyway. I mean, it's just like, it's just is. So I'm not saying something, it's not different, but it's a slightly different take, I think. I hear that I feel like we should just be taking notice of all that's going on and how much of it that does overlap with the built environment as a location and architecture as a discipline. That there is so much to find out about.
I mean, I think one of the biggest barriers in architecture, especially, is the collective ability to hold people accountable. I think we discussed it, I discussed it, me and James have discussed this for ages, is that the atomization of disabled voices and action is so, emphasised in architecture because there are so few people who go into the profession because the profession and the pedagogy itself is so limiting. Which is why, bringing in artists into it as well is valuable, because there are probably far more disabled artists than there are architects. But then, so in terms of accountability, it's very difficult to hold people accountable if you're doing it by yourself, and therefore it requires extra labour, right? And I think that's the first challenge. It's not who do we hold accountable, how do we do it? It's about actually having a collective voice to be able to do it in the first place. I think accountability is a very important one. With the AA, not a clue. Partly everyone, partly no one, partly one person, who knows? But I mean, I think it's an important question to ask.
I've got quite a boring question because I like things that are quite pragmatic, and it's about building regulations and what part they play and how they should exist. I was very fortunate to be invited by Jordan to help at one of his LSA think tanks, and I learned that Part M only caters for 40% of wheelchair users. So building regulations written in the 1970s and building regulations today don't go far enough on comfort, climate, accessibility, and safety. So do regulations just set a minimum standard that everyone adheres to? Is there an alternative, and what is that?
In terms of I completely agree. So the think tank you're talking about is we had a wonderful inclusivity and access consultant from Ramroop called May, who took some students around the theatre in Dalston to try and get them thinking about access and standards in a different way, not just about what she would record from a professional standpoint, but also about how these standards actually affect a wider variety of people. The standards are very difficult. I know personally that the standards that are put in place don't enable anyone really to live and be comfortable fully in the spaces that are designed, especially historic spaces. Funnily enough, this building itself has wonderfully beautiful big doors, which in some way is perfect, but yet the rest of the building is awful. So, in terms of accountability, I think it's I don't know where I'm going with this at all. But fundamentally, yes, they do need to be better, but I also don't think they're the right way to go about it, essentially themselves, because no matter what you do, you are going to have to at some point solidify a standard into law to be able to implement it in architecture. And as soon as you do that, you've already set limitations. So that's the issue really, is how do you both implement it legally, but also allow for a diversity of, ways of using that to be put in place.
Oh yeah, I was just, because your question provoked a little thought that I had like a while ago, was, I'm just curious, are you knowledgeable of or think that it's valuable for architects to collaborate with occupational therapists?
Yeah, go.
So Andrew Walker and his course, one of the main groups of people that participated in the course were occupational therapists, because these are people who are, their day job is to understand space and understand, it's the lived experience of people and how they need to experience space, and not just disabled people, but people who have become disabled, or people who are older, who have had an injury. Which is why I thought the value in Walker's course was that he brought in OTs, he brought in physiotherapists, as well as access consultants, very few architects, to be honest, which is probably the benefit of the course. So yeah, I think, OTs, yeah, definitely. Yeah, it ended in 1999. Not at the AA, anyway.
Sorry, I'm just conscious of time.
Yes.
Before interpreters, we've been interpreting for a long time. But there's 2 more comments. So maybe we can just take those and then you guys can respond to them and then we'll close there. But obviously, please stick around and have more conversations over all of this food and drink that's still on the table.
Yeah? Okay. Sorry.
No, go first. Go first.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mine was just following on a bit on the technical standards question, because I think I'd love to know what your opinion on that would be a little bit further. So coming from a place of practice, for me, I keep seeing inclusive design being a terminology that we are throwing around and often it's interpreted by others as access. So you might be saying now, like, there's a inclusive design department, which I think are doing wonderful work, and there's been great discussion panels. But if we say one particularly, I'm not going to say the name because it's a multidisciplinary engineering company and they are doing great work, right? But the inclusive design department, when you actually boil down the work that they do is access, is basically distilling the code, the building code. And so then what you're getting is still separate, and essentially separate's never going to be equal, right? But the building standards say that you can have 2 separate entrances and you're passing building regulations. And so I think there's this space for me where we need to be thinking about inclusive design it needs to be separate to maybe the standards as a technical, because when you think about standards as a technical piece, you're then objectifying again. And like you said earlier, we're not an object, you're human beings. So I'd love to hear from you all how we can bring that into practice.
Really glad you asked that question, because that was the point I was going to make to your point, is that regulation and law is one thing. I would love for the profession to hold itself to a much higher bar in so many respects. This is where the REBA should come in, and ARB need to step up and say, right, these are the standards that we're going to set for the profession, and if you want to be a chartered member and practice, this is what you need to set. And I completely agree with you about the interpretation of inclusive design at the moment being about accessibility and implementing that legislation and standards. I'm writing a book at the moment. Reba Publishing have actually commissioned me to write EDI in architecture, and that is going to be a really significant piece of it, is how do we set certain standards and competencies around inclusive design and inclusion generally, around how we educate and treat, progress and retain a diversity of people in the profession, because sloping off at all stages, how we create art products and designs and services, and then how we engage our communities and the full breadth and depth of those communities, our clients. So it's going to be a good book, but it's not out until spring 24.
And I know we're meant to be wrapping up, but I think for me what's really interesting about these discussions is it reminds me very much of being involved in feminist architecture in the 1980s. And there were like two sets of things going on simultaneously. And I think they can go on simultaneously, but I also think they're often in tension and even in contradiction and opposition. And one is what you do to work within the profession to make things a bit better for everybody. Fantastic. For me, you can tell from what I've been saying, I think the whole structure of what we do needs to change, and that includes we have a way. The history of the building regulations means that they're pretty terrible, and then they become something which enables you, as a student and as a practitioner, you don't have to apply your imagination. You just slap them in. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to actually engage with whether they work or not. So, for me, I guess I think that for me, it's about really challenging the profession and within your everyday life in practice. That's a difficult space to do it, but I think certainly within education, for those people who are interested, I think it's possible to really, rejig to just insist, begin to insist on things being done differently, and that in turn will have knock-on effects. Sorry, we shouldn't. There's somebody over there.
Well, I guess I just want to thank everyone for tonight, but also to really welcome Jordan into the building. I had the honour of starting teaching years ago with Andrew. When I was a student here, I met him as a student, and he was one of the most sensitive tutors of the work of the school. A very mischievous person with a great sense of humour and a wonderful laugh, which I've heard a lot of laughter tonight, which I think is an important part of how to address these things. I had just had a thought about the way the world is going, the way government, who creates standards, is going, is that they no longer think things through before they make a pronouncement. So the idea of a standard is maybe a historic inheritance that is not something that we should be seeking to replace or have better ones, but maybe that there should be an onus on a group of people to present to the authorities what the intelligent approach to access in their situation is. And that almost says everybody has to come together and formulate before they can go ahead. And that maybe this avoids the idea of a standard and simply reflects the values of the community that is being housed or educated in the architecture that's being put forward. The end.
I guess that's a great note to end on, the end. but also a huge thank you to the three of you for being part of this conversation, especially it was no small feat to kind of cover the breadth of topics that we've talked about in this series through the lens of comfort, but also to our amazing interpreters who have tirelessly worked to kind of interpret everything that you've said, and to everybody who's come to all of these. Thank you so much, and please do stick around and talk to everyone a bit more about these amazing topics tonight. Thank you.